A 62-year-old woman stands in the middle of a livestock auction crowd, her trembling hand raising a single-dollar bill to buy a dying, blind horse that nobody wants. People laugh, call her a fool. But when she sees the brand burned into the horse's flank, an old mark she hasn't seen in 40 years, her breath stops. It's her father's brand. The same father who vanished into the Montana mountains when she was 21 and never came back. That $1 horse isn't random. It's a ghost returning from the grave, and it's about to drag every buried secret into the light. If you want to know how far one woman will go to uncover a truth that powerful men tried to bury, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The auction barn smelled like manure, wet hay, and desperation. Lena Carver stood near the back, arms folded across her chest, watching the auctioneer work the crowd with the smooth patter of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. She hadn't planned on coming, hadn't planned on doing much of anything lately, if she was honest, but the flyer had been tacked to the bulletin board at the feed store, and something about it, maybe the faded ink, maybe the way it flapped in the wind like it was trying to get her attention, had pulled her here. The place was packed. Ranchers in stained Carhartt jackets, young men with too much confidence and not enough sense, a few women who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Lena fit right in with that last group. She kept her head down, her gray hair tucked under a wool cap, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her coat. She wasn't here to buy. She was here because she didn't know what else to do with a Thursday afternoon. "Next up," the auctioneer called, his voice crackling through the tinny speakers, "we got a mare, approximately 15 years old, blind in both eyes, underweight, no paperwork. She's a project horse, folks. Someone's got to take her." A few people chuckled. One man muttered, "That's a glue factory special right there." Lena looked up. They led the horse out into the center ring, and the laughter died down to murmurs. The mare was a wreck. Ribs showing, coat patchy and dull, head hanging low like she'd already given up. Her eyes were clouded over, milky white, and she stumbled once on the way to the center. The handler yanked the lead rope, and the horse flinched but didn't resist. She just stood there, swaying slightly like a tree about to fall. "Starting bid is $10, the auctioneer said, but his tone suggested even that was generous. Nobody moved. "Come on, folks. $10. Somebody give me 10. Silence. Lena's eyes drifted over the horse's body, the sunken flanks, the scarred legs, the way her hooves were cracked and overgrown. And then she saw it. On the mare's left shoulder, barely visible under the grime and matted hair, was a brand. Not a fresh one. Old. Faded almost to nothing. But Lena knew that brand. She'd seen it 100 times, burned into leather tack, carved into fence posts, stamped on the wooden gate of the ranch where she grew up. Her father's brand. A circle with a single vertical line through the center. Simple. Unmistakable. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. All right, the auctioneer sighed. "Let's try $5. Anyone? 5? Lena's hand moved before her brain caught up. She raised it, slow and steady, $1 bill pinched between her fingers. The auctioneer blinked. "Ma'am," I said, 5. "I got one," Lena said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, like it had been sitting unused for too long. A few people turned to look at her. Someone snorted. "Lady, that horse is half dead," a man near the front said. "You'd be doing her a favor to let her go to slaughter." Lena didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. $1. The auctioneer scratched his jaw, glanced at the handler, then shrugged. "Sold to the woman in the back for $1. Congratulations, ma'am, she's all yours." The crowd muttered and shifted, already losing interest, moving on to the next lot. Lena walked down to the ring, her legs feeling heavier with each step. Up close, the mare looked even worse. Her breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. Flies buzzed around her ears. The handler held out the lead rope like he couldn't wait to be rid of it. "Good luck with that," he said, smirking. Lena took the rope. The mare's head swung toward her, nostrils flaring, trying to catch a scent. Lena reached out slowly and laid her palm flat against the horse's neck. The skin was warm, the pulse underneath it faint but steady. "I know," Lena whispered. "I know who you belonged to." Odd. She didn't have a trailer. Didn't even have a truck anymore. She'd sold it 2 years ago when the ranch went under and she moved into the small cabin at the edge of town. So she walked the mare home 3 miles along the shoulder of the highway, cars honking as they passed. The mare stumbled twice, and each time Lena stopped, waited, let her catch her breath. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was low and orange, casting long shadows across the scrub grass. Lena led the mare into the old lean-to behind the house, barely more than a roof and 3 walls, but it would do. She filled a bucket with water from the pump and set it down. The mare dipped her nose in, drank a little, then stopped. "Not too much," Lena said. "You'll make yourself sick." She stood there for a while, just watching. The mare's breathing evened out. Her ears swiveled, tracking sounds Lena couldn't hear. The brand on her shoulder seemed darker now in the fading light, like it was burned fresh. Lena's father had been a horseman. A good one. He'd run a small outfit up in the high country, breeding and training ranch horses, selling them to outfits across Montana and Wyoming. He wasn't rich, but he was respected. People knew his horses, knew his brand. And then, 40 years ago, he disappeared. Lena had been 21. She just finished a semester at the university in Missoula, came home for the summer, and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a blank stare. "Your father went up to the North Camp," her mother had said. "He didn't come back." Search parties went out. They found his camp, tent still standing, fire pit cold, his horse tied to a tree. But no sign of him. No tracks leading away. No note. Nothing. The official story was that he'd gotten lost, maybe fallen into a ravine or a river. The unofficial story, the one people whispered over beers at the saloon, was that he'd run off, left his family, started over somewhere else. Lena's mother never believed either version. She just stopped. Stopped talking about him, stopped going into town, stopped living, really. She lasted another 8 years before a stroke took her, and by then Lena had already given up asking questions. But now, standing in the dim light of the lean-to, staring at a dying horse with her father's brand burned into its hide, all those questions came roaring back. The next morning, Lena called the vet. Dr. Holloway was a gruff man in his 60s, the kind of guy who didn't waste words. He pulled up in his truck an hour later, climbed out with his bag, and followed Lena to the lean-to without saying hello. He spent 10 minutes examining the mare, checking her teeth, her eyes, her legs, listening to her lungs. When he finally straightened up, he shook his head. Malnutrition, dehydration, possible pneumonia. She's got laminitis in both front hooves, and those eyes are gone for good. Cataracts, maybe trauma. Hard to say. "Can she be saved?" Lena asked. Holloway looked at her like she'd just asked if the sky was green. "Saved? Lady, this horse is 20 years old if she's a day. She's been neglected for months, maybe longer. Best thing you can do is put her down." "That's not what I asked," Holloway sighed. "You want the truth? Maybe. If you pour money and time into her, keep her comfortable, manage the pain, maybe she gets another year. But she'll never be writable. She'll never be useful." "I'm not looking for useful," Lena said. Holloway stared at her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your dollar. I'll leave you some antibiotics and anti-inflammatories. Call me if she takes a turn." He left without another word. Lena stood in the lean-to, watching the mare shift her weight from hoof to hoof, trying to ease the pain. She reached out and touched the brand again, tracing the faded circle with her fingertip. "Where did you come from?" she whispered. "Who had you?" The mare didn't answer, but Lena felt something stirring inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope exactly. It was sharper than that, meaner. It was the need to know. She started asking questions that afternoon. First stop was the auction house. The woman behind the desk was young, bored, scrolling through her phone when Lena walked in. "I bought a horse yesterday," Lena said, "the blind mare. I need to know where she came from." The woman didn't look up. "We don't track that. You have to have some record, a name, a brand inspection, something." "Lady, half the horses that come through here are strays or seizures. People dump them, we sell them. That's it." Lena leaned on the counter. "I need to know." The woman finally looked up, annoyed. Then she saw Lena's face, the hard line of her jaw, the way her eyes didn't blink, and her expression shifted. "Hold on," she muttered. She tapped at her computer for a minute, then frowned. Says here she came in with a lot from a ranch liquidation up near Choteau. Owner died. Estate sold everything off. What was the owner's name? Victor Hale? Lena's stomach dropped. Hale? Yeah. You know him? Lena didn't answer. She turned and walked out. What? Victor Hale. She hadn't heard that name in decades, but she knew it. Everyone in the county knew it. Hale had been a big rancher back in the day. Thousands of acres, political connections, money coming out of his ears. He'd also been one of the last people to see Lena's father alive. They'd had a meeting, her mother said. Something about grazing rights or water access. Lena couldn't remember the details. But her father had driven up to Hale's ranch the day before he disappeared. And when the search parties went out, Hale had been cooperative, helpful even. He'd sent his own men to comb the hills. But Lena's mother had never trusted him. She'd said once, late at night after too much whiskey, that Hale's eyes were wrong, that he smiled too much when he talked about the search. Lena drove into town, parked outside the library, and went inside. The librarian, a thin woman named Ruth, greeted her with a nod. I need to look at old newspapers, Lena said, from about 40 years ago, June of 1984. Ruth raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She led Lena to the back room where rolls of microfiche sat in dusty boxes. Lena threaded the film into the machine and started scrolling. It didn't take long to find it. The headline was small, buried on page 3 of the local weekly, Local Rancher Missing in High Country. The article was short. Her father's name, Daniel Carver. His age, 46. The location of his last known camp. The fact that search efforts were ongoing. And at the bottom, a quote from Victor Hale. Dan was a good man and a friend. We're doing everything we can to bring him home. Lena's hands tightened on the edge of the machine. She scrolled forward through the next few weeks. More articles. Search called off. No trace found. And then nothing. The story disappeared, swallowed by time. She scrolled back and started looking at the months before her father vanished. Business news, livestock sales. A brief mention of a federal land dispute involving grazing permits. And then, tucked into a corner of the May 12th edition, a single paragraph. Hale Ranch under investigation for permit violations. Lena leaned closer. The article was vague, something about allegations of illegal grazing on federal land, a pending review by the Bureau of Land Management. It didn't name names, but it mentioned Victor Hale's ranch specifically. 2 weeks later, the story vanished. No follow-up, no resolution. And 3 weeks after that, her father disappeared. Lena drove home with her mind spinning. She sat in the cabin that night, staring at the fire, trying to piece it together. Her father had gone to see Hale. They'd talked about something, grazing, land, permits, and then her father vanished and Hale walked away clean. And now, 40 years later, a horse with her father's brand turned up at an auction, coming from Hale's estate. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even close. But it was enough to make her hands shake. She got up and walked to the back of the cabin, to the small closet where she'd shoved everything from her mother's house after she died. Boxes of old clothes, photo albums, papers. She pulled them out one by one, dumping them on the floor, searching. At the bottom of the last box, wrapped in a faded pillowcase, she found it. A leather journal. Her mother's handwriting on the cover, Daniel's Things. Lena opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, letters, a few photos. And tucked into the back, folded into a tight square, was a hand-drawn map. Lena spread it out on the table. It was rough, sketched in pencil, but she recognized the landmarks, the ridgeline above the north camp, the creek that ran down into the valley, the old fire tower on the peak. And at the center of the map, marked with an X, were 2 words in her father's handwriting, Last Camp. Beneath it, in smaller letters, if something happens, start here. Lena stared at the map for a long time. Her father had known. He'd known something was wrong, and he'd left this behind just in case. She folded the map carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Then she walked outside into the cold night air and looked at the mare standing in the lean-to. The horse's blind eyes stared at nothing, but her ears swiveled toward Lena's footsteps. I'm going to call you Ash, Lena said quietly. Because you came back from something that should have killed you. The mare snorted, shook her head. Lena reached out and rested her hand on the brand one more time. And you and me, she said, we're going to find out what happened up there. The decision to go into the mountains wasn't something Lena made all at once. It built itself piece by piece over the next 3 days while she watched Ash grow stronger. The mare ate slowly, her blind head lowered to the grain bucket like she didn't quite trust it wouldn't be taken away. Lena sat on an overturned crate in the lean-to, the map spread across her knees, tracing the lines her father had drawn 40 years ago. The high country wasn't easy terrain. It never had been. Steep ridges, loose scree, weather that could turn from clear to whiteout in 20 minutes. Her father had known those mountains better than anyone, and they'd still swallowed him whole. But the map was specific. The landmarks were real. And if he'd left it behind with those words, if something happens, start here, then he'd meant for someone to follow. Lena folded the map and stood. Ash's ears swiveled toward her. You're not strong enough yet, Lena said, but you will be. She spent the next week preparing. She dug her old camping gear out of the shed, tent with a torn rainfly, sleeping bag that smelled like mildew, a backpack with one broken buckle. She patched what she could and replaced what she couldn't. She bought supplies in town, paying cash, keeping her head down. Canned food, jerky, water purification tablets, a first aid kit. A used saddle from the consignment shop that looked like it had been through a war but still held together. And she worked with Ash. Not riding, not yet. Just leading her around the property, letting her get used to the feel of a saddle on her back, the weight of saddlebags hanging off her sides. The mare moved cautiously, her hooves careful on the uneven ground, but she didn't spook. She just walked, her breath steady, her blind eyes staring straight ahead. On the 8th day, Lena saddled her for real. She moved slowly, talking the whole time, letting Ash smell everything before it touched her. When the saddle finally settled into place and the cinch tightened, the mare stood perfectly still. Lena put her foot in the stirrup and paused. Ash's ears flicked back. Easy, Lena murmured. I'm not going to hurt you. She swung up into the saddle. Ash shifted beneath her, adjusting to the weight, but she didn't move. Lena sat there for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the horse beneath her, the slight sway as Ash breathed. Then she squeezed her legs gently, and Ash took a step forward. They walked like that for an hour, just circling the property. Ash learning to trust Lena's cues, Lena learning to read the mare's hesitations. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't graceful, but it worked. That night, Lena loaded the saddlebags with everything she'd need and set them by the door. She made coffee, sat at the table, and stared at the map one more time. The trailhead was a 2-day ride north. From there, it was another day up into the high basin where her father's last camp had been. 3 days in, 3 days back. A week if nothing went wrong. She didn't let herself think about what might go wrong. The next morning, she locked the cabin, tied the saddlebags onto Ash, and mounted up. The mare stood quietly, waiting. Lena took a breath, gathered the reins, and turned Ash toward the north. They left before sunrise. The first day was slow. Ash moved carefully, her hooves picking through the rocky trail like she was reading the ground with her feet. Lena let her set the pace, only guiding when the path forked or when the terrain got too rough. They stopped every couple of hours to rest, to let Ash drink from the streams they crossed, to give Lena's back a break from the saddle. By the time the sun started to drop, they'd covered maybe 15 miles. Lena found a flat spot near a creek, dismounted, and set up camp. She unsaddled Ash, rubbed her down with a cloth, and hobbled her near the water where the grass was thick. The mare lowered her head and started grazing, her tail swishing at flies. Lena built a small fire, boiled water for coffee, and ate a can of beans straight from the tin. The sky turned purple, then black, and the stars came out so thick it looked like someone had spilled salt across the sky. She sat with her back against a rock, the fire crackling in front of her, and let herself feel the silence. It had been a long time since she'd been this far from anything. A long time since she'd let herself stop moving long enough to think. She pulled the map out and studied it by firelight. The trailhead was close now, maybe another half-day's ride. From there, the terrain got steeper, the trails less defined. Her father's camp had been high up, near the tree line, in a basin that caught runoff from the peaks above. Lena folded the map and tucked it back into her jacket. Across the fire, Ash stood with her head low, asleep on her feet. The mare's ribs still showed, but not as sharply. Her coat had started to fill in where the bare patches had been. Lena closed her eyes and listened to the creek, the wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl. For the first time in years, she felt like she was doing something that mattered. She woke to the sound of voices. It was still dark, maybe an hour before dawn. Lena sat up fast, her hand going to the hunting knife she kept in her boot. The fire had burned down to coals, barely glowing. Ash stood 20 feet away, her head raised, ears pricked forward. The voices came again, low, male, too far away to make out words. Lena stayed perfectly still, her heart hammering. Slowly she reached for the coals and scattered dirt over them, snuffing out the light. Then she moved toward Ash, keeping low. The mare's nostrils flared, but she didn't make a sound. Lena put a hand on her neck, felt the tension in the muscles beneath the skin. The voices got closer. 2 men, maybe 3. Footsteps crunching on gravel. A beam of light swept across the trees to the east, a flashlight. Lena's mind raced. Hikers? This early? This far off the main trails? It didn't make sense. One of the voices rose, clearer now. Said she came through here yesterday. Old woman on a blind horse. Can't be hard to track. Lena's blood went cold. Another voice, rougher. She's headed for the basin. Has to be. Then we stop her before she gets there. The flashlight beam swung closer. Lena grabbed Ash's lead rope and moved, pulling the mare deeper into the trees, away from the camp. Ash followed without hesitation, her hooves silent on the soft ground. They slipped between the pines, the darkness swallowing them, and Lena kept moving, one hand on Ash's shoulder, the other gripping the knife. Behind them, the men reached the camp. She heard them talking, their voices sharper now. Fire's fresh. She was here. Can't be far. Spread out. Find her. Lena kept moving. Her lungs burned. Her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She didn't know who these men were or how they knew where she was going, but she knew one thing for certain. They weren't here to help. She moved uphill into rougher terrain where the trees grew thicker and the ground turned steep. Ash struggled, stumbling once, but Lena held her steady. They climbed for what felt like hours, the sky slowly lightening above them, until finally Lena found a narrow ravine choked with brush. She led Ash into it, deep enough that they couldn't be seen from the trail, and stopped. Ash was breathing hard, her sides heaving. Lena leaned against her, trying to catch her own breath, her mind spinning. They knew. Somehow, they knew she was coming. She crouched down and pulled out the map, studied it in the growing light. The basin was still a day away, maybe more now that she'd gone off course. But if those men were following her, she couldn't take the direct route. She'd have to go higher, stay off the trails, move through country that would slow them down. It would add at least another day. Maybe 2. Lena looked at Ash. The mare stood with her head low, her blind eyes half closed, exhausted. Lena reached out and touched the brand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but we can't stop." She waited until the sun was fully up, until she was sure the men had moved on, and then she led Ash out of the ravine and started climbing again. The next 2 days blurred together. Lena stayed off the main trails, picking her way through dense timber and across loose talus slopes that shifted under Ash's hooves. They moved slowly, stopping often, and Lena kept her eyes on the ridge above them, watching for movement, for any sign they were being followed. She saw no one, but she felt them. Felt the weight of being watched, the prickling certainty that she wasn't alone out here. On the 3rd day, she reached the tree line. The basin spread out below her, a wide, bowl-shaped valley ringed by jagged peaks, the ground covered in low scrub and patches of late summer snow. A stream cut through the center, glinting in the sunlight. Lena pulled out the map and checked the landmarks. The fire tower on the eastern peak, the split rock formation to the west, the creek that ran north-south through the middle. This was it. Her father's last camp. She urged Ash forward down into the basin. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, carrying the smell of pine and stone. Lena scanned the ground as they moved, looking for anything: tent poles, a fire ring, gear left behind. It took her an hour to find it. A flat spot near the creek, sheltered by a low outcrop of rock. The fire ring was still there, stones blackened with old ash. Nearby, half buried in the dirt, was a rusted tent stake. Lena dismounted and stood in the center of the camp. 40 years. 40 years since her father had stood in this exact spot and the only proof he'd been here was a circle of rocks and a piece of metal. She knelt and brushed the dirt away from the fire ring, looking for anything else. Her fingers hit something hard. She dug deeper and pulled out a small tin box, the kind used for matches. The lid was rusted shut. Lena pried it open with her knife. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Her hand shook as she unfolded it. The ink was faded, but she could still make out the words, written in her father's handwriting. Hale is running cattle on federal land. Falsified permits. Bribes to BLM inspectors. Evidence buried at the North Ridge fence line. If I don't make it back, make sure someone knows. Lena read it 3 times, her heart pounding. Her father had known. He'd found proof that Hale was breaking the law, stealing federal land for his own profit, and he'd hidden the evidence. But where? The North Ridge fence line could be anywhere. She stood and looked around the basin. To the north, the ridge rose steeply, disappearing into clouds. Somewhere up there, her father had buried something important enough to get him killed. Lena tucked the note into her pocket and turned to Ash. The mare stood by the creek, drinking. Lena walked over, checked the saddle, and was about to mount when she heard it. The sound of an engine. She froze. Out here, miles from any road, there shouldn't be engines. But the sound was unmistakable, a low mechanical growl echoing off the peaks. Lena looked up. On the ridge to the east, 2 ATVs appeared, racing down the slope toward the basin. Her stomach dropped. She grabbed Ash's reins and swung into the saddle. The mare sensed her urgency and moved without hesitation, breaking into a rough trot toward the North Ridge. Behind them, the ATVs roared closer, their engines screaming. Lena leaned low over Ash's neck, urging her faster. The mare's hooves pounded against the rocky ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The ridge loomed ahead, steep and covered in loose scree. The ATVs split up, one coming straight at them, the other cutting around to the west to flank them. Lena turned Ash sharply, heading for a narrow gap between 2 boulders. The mare squeezed through, stumbling on the uneven ground, but she kept moving. The first ATV roared up behind them, close enough that Lena could hear the rider shouting. She didn't look back. She drove Ash up the slope, into terrain too rough for the machines, and the ATV fell back, the engine whining in protest. But the second one was still coming. Lena pushed Ash harder, the mare's sides heaving, her hooves slipping on the scree. They reached a narrow ledge that cut across the face of the ridge, barely wide enough for a horse. Lena guided Ash onto it, her heart in her throat. Below them, the ATV skidded to a stop. The rider, a man in a dark jacket, got off and pulled something from his belt. A rifle. Lena kicked Ash forward. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the basin, and rock exploded inches from Ash's hooves. The mare flinched but didn't stop. Lena leaned close to her neck, talking to her, keeping her moving. Another shot. This one went wide. The ledge ended at a steep slope covered in loose rock. Lena didn't hesitate. She turned Ash downhill and let gravity take them. The mare half ran, half slid, her hooves scrambling for purchase, and Lena held on, her knuckles white on the reins. They hit the bottom hard, Ash stumbling forward, but she stayed upright. Lena looked back. The men on the ridge were shouting, pointing, but they couldn't follow. Not on foot, not fast enough. Lena turned Ash north and kept riding. By the time the sun started to set, Lena had put miles between herself and the basin. She was high up now, above the tree line, in a landscape of rock and wind and nothing else. Ash moved slowly, her head low, her breathing labored. Lena knew the mare was spent, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. She found a sheltered spot behind a jumble of boulders and dismounted. Ash stood with her legs splayed, trembling. Lena unsaddled her, rubbed her down, and covered her with a blanket. Then she sat with her back against the rock, her rifle across her lap, and watched the ridge below. The men were out there. She didn't know how many or how well armed, but they were coming, and they knew what she was looking for. Lena pulled out the note again and read it by the last light of the day. The North Ridge fence line. Her father had been specific. Somewhere up here, buried in the ground, was the evidence that Victor Hale had killed to protect. And Lena was going to find it. She looked at Ash, standing in the fading light, her blind eyes staring at nothing. The mare had carried her this far, farther than Lena had any right to ask, and she wasn't done yet. Lena reached out and rested her hand on the brand one more time. "We're close," she said quietly. I can feel it. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, and Lena pulled her jacket tighter. She didn't sleep that night. She just sat in the dark, listening to the wind, waiting for the sound of engines. Dawn came with frost on the rocks and a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Lena's joints ached from sitting all night in the cold, her back stiff against the boulder. She stood slowly, her muscles protesting, and walked over to where Ash stood under the blanket. The mare's breathing was shallow, but steady. When Lena touched her neck, the skin was warm. "Good girl," Lena murmured. "We're not done yet." She pulled out the map and studied it in the early light. The North Ridge fence line. Her father had written it down like it was a landmark everyone would know, but Lena had never heard of it. She tried to remember the old ranch boundaries, the way the federal land butted up against private property. Fence lines meant borders. Borders meant disputes, and disputes meant records. Lena folded the map and looked north. The ridge rose in a series of rocky shelves, each one steeper than the last. Somewhere up there, buried under 40 years of weather and erosion, was a fence line that didn't exist on any current map. Finding it would be like looking for a single strand of wire in 100 square miles of wilderness. But her father had left the clue for a reason. He'd wanted someone to find it. She saddled Ash, moving quickly, her fingers clumsy in the cold. The mare stood patiently, her blind eyes half closed. Lena swung into the saddle and turned Ash uphill, toward the ridge. They climbed for 2 hours, the terrain getting rougher with every step. Loose rock slid under Ash's hooves, and twice the mare stumbled, catching herself at the last second. Lena kept her moving, talking to her constantly, keeping her calm. The wind picked up as they gained elevation, cutting through Lena's jacket like it wasn't there. And then she saw it. A length of rusted barbed wire, half buried in the scree, running east to west across the slope. Lena dismounted and knelt beside it, brushing the dirt away. The wire was old, brittle, the barbs worn smooth by decades of wind. She followed it with her eyes, tracing its path up the ridge and down into a narrow gully. This was it, the North Ridge fence line. Lena stood and walked along the wire, scanning the ground. Her father's note had said the evidence was buried here, but where? The fence line stretched for hundreds of yards, disappearing into the rocks above and below. It could be anywhere. She stopped and closed her eyes, trying to think like her father would have thought. He'd been a practical man, not given to drama or elaborate hiding places. If he'd buried something, he would have put it somewhere he could find again, somewhere memorable. Lena opened her eyes and looked up the slope. Above her, maybe 50 yards away, a twisted juniper grew out of the rocks, its trunk bent nearly horizontal by the wind. It was the only tree for a quarter mile in any direction. She climbed toward it, her boots slipping on the loose ground. When she reached the juniper, she saw it, a cairn of stacked stones, half collapsed, sitting at the base of the tree. Lena's heart kicked. She knelt and started pulling the stones away, one by one. Underneath was a flat piece of shale, and beneath that a hole dug into the rocky soil. Inside the hole was a metal box. Lena pulled it out with shaking hands. It was a small ammunition box, the kind used by the military, sealed with a rusted clasp. She pried it open. Inside were papers, yellowed, water-stained, but still legible. Lena spread them out on the ground and started reading. Permits. Grazing permits issued by the Bureau of Land Management, signed and dated. But the signatures were wrong, forged, Lena realized, comparing them to the official stamps. The allotment numbers didn't match the legal boundaries. And clipped to the permits were photographs, black and white images of cattle grazing on land clearly marked with federal survey stakes. At the bottom of the box was a ledger. Handwritten entries, columns of numbers, dates going back years, payments made to BLM inspectors, bribes listed by name and amount. Lena sat back on her heels, her mind racing. This was it. This was what her father had found. Victor Hale had been running an illegal grazing operation on federal land for years, bribing inspectors to look the other way, forging permits to cover his tracks. And when her father stumbled onto it, Hale had made sure he never got the chance to tell anyone. Lena's hands clenched around the ledger. 40 years. 40 years her father had been gone, and the man who killed him had walked free, rich and respected, until the day he died. But the evidence was still here, and Lena was going to make sure it saw the light of day. She started to put the papers back in the box when she heard the sound of boots on rock. Lena froze. Slowly, she turned her head. 3 men stood 20 feet away, spread out in a loose line across the slope. They wore heavy jackets, hiking boots, and each one carried a rifle. The man in the center was older, maybe 50, with a weathered face and cold eyes. He smiled when he saw Lena looking. "Mrs. Carver," he said. His voice was smooth, almost friendly. "You've led us on quite a chase." Lena's hand moved toward the hunting knife in her boot, but the man shook his head. "I wouldn't," he said. "My associates here are a little jumpy. Might mistake that for aggression." Lena straightened slowly, leaving the knife where it was. Her mind raced. 3 men, 3 rifles. And she was alone on an exposed slope with nowhere to run. "Who are you?" she asked. The man tilted his head. "Name's Carter. I work for the Hale estate. Or I did, until Victor passed. Now I work for his son, Marcus." Hale had a son? 2, actually. Marcus is the oldest. He inherited the ranch, the land, and all the legal trouble that comes with it. Carter gestured at the metal box lying on the ground. "Including whatever's in there." Lena shifted her weight, putting herself between Carter and the box. "This doesn't belong to him." "That's debatable," Carter said. "See, Marcus has been cleaning up his father's messes for years, and this particular mess," he nodded at the box, "was supposed to stay buried. But then you showed up at that auction and bought a horse you had no business buying, and here we are." "You've been following me since the auction?" "Since before that," Carter said. "We've had people watching you for weeks. Ever since you started asking questions about Victor, we figured it was only a matter of time before you came up here." Lena's stomach turned. They'd been watching her, waiting. "So what now?" she asked. "You shoot me? Bury me up here like you did my father?" Carter's smile faded. "Your father's death was unfortunate. Victor didn't want it to happen, but Daniel wouldn't let it go. He kept digging, kept asking questions, left Victor no choice." "There's always a choice. Not when you're protecting an empire," Carter said. "Victor built something up here. Thousands of acres, millions of dollars, a legacy. Your father was going to destroy all of that over a technicality. So Victor made a decision, and now Marcus is making the same one." Lena's jaw tightened. "You're not walking out of here with that box." Carter sighed. "Mrs. Carver, you're 62 years old. You're alone. You've got a blind horse and a hunting knife. We've got 3 rifles and orders to retrieve that evidence by any means necessary. Now, I'd prefer to do this peacefully. You hand over the box, we let you ride back down the mountain, and everyone goes home. But if you make this difficult—" "I'm not giving you anything," Lena said. Carter stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded to the men on either side of him. They raised their rifles. Lena moved without thinking. She grabbed the metal box, turned, and threw herself down the slope. Gunfire cracked behind her, bullets kicking up dirt and rock. She hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up running. Her boots slipped on the scree, and she went down again, the box flying from her hands. Behind her, Carter shouted, "Don't kill her! We need to know if she made copies!" Lena scrambled to her feet and lunged for the box. Her fingers closed around the handle just as one of the men reached her. He grabbed her jacket and yanked her backward. Lena twisted, drove her elbow into his ribs, and he grunted, loosening his grip. She broke free and ran. Ash was 20 yards away, still saddled, her ears pinned back at the sound of gunfire. Lena sprinted toward her, the box clutched to her chest. Behind her, boots pounded on rock. She reached Ash and threw the box into the saddlebag. The mare shied, stepping sideways, but Lena grabbed the reins and swung into the saddle. She kicked Ash hard, and the mare bolted. Gunfire erupted again, louder this time. Lena leaned low over Ash's neck, urging her faster. The mare's hooves slid on the loose ground, but she kept moving, driven by fear and adrenaline. Bullets whined past, one so close Lena felt the air move. She drove Ash down the slope, into the gully where the fence line disappeared into the rocks. The terrain was too rough for anyone to follow on foot, but she didn't slow down. She kept pushing, kept moving, until the gunfire faded behind them, and the only sound was Ash's labored breathing and the clatter of hooves on stone. Lena didn't stop until they were a mile away, deep in a narrow canyon choked with scrub pine. She dismounted, her legs shaking, and leaned against Ash's side. The mare stood with her head down, her sides heaving, foam dripping from her mouth. "I'm sorry," Lena whispered, running her hand down Ash's neck. "I'm so sorry." She checked the saddlebag. The metal box was still there, dented but intact. Lena pulled it out and opened it, making sure the papers were still inside. They were. She sat down on a rock and tried to think. Carter and his men were still out there, and they wouldn't stop. They'd track her, follow her all the way back to civilization if they had to. And she couldn't outrun them forever. Ash was exhausted, and Lena wasn't much better. But she had the evidence. She had proof of what Victor Hale had done, proof that could bring down his son and everyone who'd helped cover it up. She just needed to get it to someone who could use it. Lena pulled out the map and studied it. The nearest town was 2 days' ride south, maybe more at the pace Ash could manage. But there was another option, a fire lookout tower on the eastern peak, maybe 6 miles from here. It was old, probably abandoned, but it might still have a radio, or at least a clear line of sight to signal for help. It was a gamble, but it was the only chance she had. Lena folded the map and looked at Ash. The mare's breathing had slowed, but she was still trembling. Lena ran her hand over the brand on her shoulder, the circle with the line through it. "One more push," she said quietly. "That's all I need from you." She stood, checked the saddle, and mounted up. Ash moved slowly, her hooves dragging, but she moved. Lena turned her east toward the peak and started riding. The climb to the fire tower took 4 hours. The trail was steep, the air thin, and Lena's lungs burned with every breath. Ash stumbled twice, and the second time she went down to her knees. Lena dismounted and led her the rest of the way on foot, pulling her up the slope one step at a time. When they finally reached the tower, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocks. The structure was old, built of weathered wood and rusted metal, standing on stilts 30 feet above the ground. A wooden staircase zigzagged up the side, half the steps missing or rotted through. Lena tied Ash to a post at the base and climbed the stairs, testing each step before putting her weight on it. The door at the top was locked, but the wood was so old it splintered when she kicked it. She stepped inside. The room was small, maybe 10 feet square, with windows on all sides. Dust covered everything, an old desk, a chair, a shelf full of rotting maps. In the corner was a radio, the kind used by Forest Service crews decades ago. Lena walked over and examined it. The casing was cracked, the dials corroded, but the power cable was still attached. She flipped the switch. Nothing. She tried again, jiggling the connection. Still nothing. Lena sat down in the chair and put her head in her hands. She was out of options. The radio was dead, Ash couldn't go any farther, and Carter's men were still out there, closing in. She looked out the window, at the ridges stretching away in every direction, and for the first time since she'd started this, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She was tired, bone-tired, and she didn't know if she had anything left. Then she saw the smoke. It was rising from the canyon to the west, thin and gray, barely visible against the darkening sky. Campfire smoke. Lena stood and stared at it. Carter's men. They'd stopped for the night, maybe a mile away, close enough to reach the tower by morning. She turned back to the radio and tried one more time, flipping switches, adjusting dials. And then, faint beneath the static, she heard it. A voice. "Anyone copy? This is Ranger Station 7. Does anyone copy?" Lena grabbed the microphone and pressed the button. "This is Lena Carver. I'm at the old fire tower on the East Ridge. I need help." Static. "Please," Lena said. "I have evidence of a federal crime. There are men trying to kill me. I need help." More static. And then the voice came back, clearer this time. "Lena Carver, this is Ranger Station 7. We copy. What's your situation?" Lena's hands shook as she pressed the button again. "I'm alone. I have evidence that Victor Hale was running illegal cattle on federal land for decades. He killed my father to cover it up. His sons sent men after me. They're armed. They're close. I need federal authorities up here now." There was a long pause. Then the voice said, "Copy that. Stay where you are. We're contacting federal law enforcement. Help is on the way." Lena set the microphone down and sank into the chair. Her whole body was shaking. She looked out the window at the smoke rising from the canyon and knew Carter would come for her in the morning, but help was coming. She just had to survive the night. Lena climbed down from the tower and brought Ash inside the lower level, a small storage area beneath the main room. It wasn't much shelter, but it was better than leaving her exposed. She unsaddled the mare, gave her the last of the grain, and covered her with the blanket. Then she went back up to the tower and barricaded the door with the desk. She pulled her rifle from her pack, checked the magazine, and sat by the window facing west. The sun set. The sky turned purple, then black. And Lena waited. Sometime after midnight, she saw the lights, flashlights, moving through the trees below, heading toward the tower. 3 of them. Carter and his men. Lena's heart pounded. She checked her rifle again, her hands slick with sweat. She wasn't a killer. She'd never shot anyone in her life. But she had the high ground, and she had the evidence, and she wasn't going to let them take it. The lights got closer. She could hear voices now, low and cautious. They reached the base of the tower and stopped. Carter's voice called up. "Mrs. Carver, I know you're up there, and I know you called for help, but help isn't coming fast enough, so let's talk." Lena didn't answer. "You've got something that belongs to the Hale family," Carter continued, "and we're not leaving without it. Now, we can do this the easy way, or we can burn that tower down with you in it. Your choice." Lena stood and moved to the window. Below, she could see the 3 men spread out around the base of the tower. Carter stood in the center, looking up. "You won't burn it," Lena called down. "Not with the evidence inside. You need to know if I made copies." Carter smiled. "Smart. But we've got time, and you don't. So what's it going to be?" Lena raised her rifle and fired a shot into the dirt at Carter's feet. He jumped back, swearing. "That's my answer," Lena said. Carter's expression hardened. He nodded to the men beside him, and they raised their rifles. Lena ducked back from the window just as gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the walls, shattering glass, splintering wood. She dropped to the floor, covering her head. The shooting went on for what felt like forever, and then it stopped. Silence. Lena crawled to the window and looked out. The men were moving, spreading out, one heading for the stairs. She aimed and fired. The shot went wide, but it was close enough. The man scrambled back, shouting. Carter's voice rose. "You can't hold out forever!" Lena didn't answer. She reloaded and fired again, keeping them pinned down. But she knew he was right. She had maybe 20 rounds left, and when they were gone, she had nothing. She looked at the metal box sitting on the desk. Her father had died for what was inside it. She wasn't going to let it fall into the wrong hands. Below, she heard the men talking, planning, and then, through the broken window, she smelled it. Smoke. Lena's stomach dropped. She leaned out and looked down. One of the men was at the base of the tower, piling dry brush against the wooden stilts. Carter stood beside him, holding a lighter. "Last chance, Mrs. Carver," Carter shouted. Lena grabbed the metal box, slung her rifle over her shoulder, and ran for the door. She shoved the desk aside and threw the door open. The stairs were already starting to smoke, flames licking up the supports below. She had no choice. She started down, moving as fast as she dared, the old wood creaking under her weight. Halfway down, a step gave way. Lena grabbed the railing, barely catching herself. The metal box slipped from her hands and tumbled down the stairs, hitting the ground with a crash. Carter was there in an instant, picking it up. He smiled at Lena, still clinging to the railing. "Thank you," he said. And then the night exploded with light and sound. Helicopters roared overhead, searchlights cutting through the darkness. Vehicles crashed through the brush below, and voices shouted through megaphones. "Federal agents! Drop your weapons!" Carter froze. His men scattered, but there was nowhere to run. Armed agents poured out of the vehicles, surrounding them, rifles raised. Lena climbed down the rest of the stairs, her legs barely holding her. An agent caught her as she stumbled, steadying her. "Lena Carver?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak. "You're safe now," he said. "We've got them." Lena looked over at Carter. He was on his knees, hands behind his head, the metal box lying in the dirt beside him. An agent picked it up and brought it over to Lena. "This yours?" he asked. Lena took it, held it against her chest, and closed her eyes. "Yeah," she whispered. "It's mine." The agent led Lena away from the burning tower, his hand steady on her elbow. Her legs felt like water, barely holding her weight. Behind them, the fire crackled and spat, flames climbing higher into the night sky. 2 agents wrestled Carter to the ground while another cuffed his wrists. The man was shouting something about lawyers and rights, but his voice was drowned out by the helicopter rotors still thundering overhead. Lena clutched the metal box tighter and looked back toward the storage area beneath the tower. "My horse," she said, her voice hoarse. "I need to get my horse." The agent glanced at the structure. The flames hadn't reached the lower level yet, but they would. "Ma'am, we need to get you clear of the area. The fire's spreading." "I'm not leaving without her." Something in Lena's tone made the agent stop. He looked at her face, then nodded. "All right. Where is she?" "Under there. Bottom level." He called over to two other agents. "Get the horse out. Now." They ran toward the tower, disappearing into the smoke. Lena watched, her heart hammering. Seconds felt like hours. And then they emerged, leading Ash by her halter, the mare stumbling but moving. When they brought her over, Lena let go of the metal box long enough to wrap her arms around Ash's neck. The mare's coat was damp with sweat and fear, but she leaned into Lena's touch. "You're okay," Lena whispered. "We're okay." One of the agents picked up the metal box from where Lena had set it down. He turned it over in his hands, then looked at her. "This is what they were after?" Lena nodded. "What's inside?" "Proof," Lena said. "Proof that Victor Hale stole federal land for 40 years. Proof that he killed my father to keep it quiet." The agent's expression shifted. He looked at the box again, then at Carter being dragged toward one of the vehicles. "We're going to need you to come with us. Give a full statement. This is going to be a long night." Lena glanced at Ash. "Can someone take care of my horse?" "We've got a livestock trailer down at the base camp," another agent said. "We'll get her loaded up, get some water, and feed into her. She'll be all right." Lena hesitated, then nodded. She stroked Ash's neck one more time before letting them lead the mare away. Then she turned back to the agent holding the box. "Let's get this over with," she said. They took her down the mountain in one of the vehicles, a heavy-duty truck with reinforced tires that barely handled the rough terrain. Lena sat in the back, the metal box on her lap, staring out the window at the darkness. Her mind was still racing, replaying the gunfire, the flames, Carter's face when the agents closed in. She'd come so close to losing everything. At the base camp, a cluster of tents and portable lights had been set up in a clearing. Agents moved in and out, radios crackling, voices sharp with urgency. They led Lena to a tent with a folding table and two chairs. A woman in her 40s with short gray hair and a no-nonsense expression was waiting inside. "Mrs. Carver," the woman said, standing. "I'm Special Agent Marlowe, Bureau of Land Management. Have a seat." Lena sat. The metal box was still in her hands. Marlowe gestured to it. "That's the evidence?" Lena set it on the table and opened it. Marlowe leaned forward, pulling out the papers one by one. The forged permits, the photographs, the ledger. Her eyes moved quickly over the pages, and Lena watched her expression harden. "How long have you had this?" Marlowe asked. "I dug it up this morning. My father buried it 40 years ago, right before he disappeared." Marlowe looked up. "Your father was Daniel Carver. You know about him?" "I know the case," Marlowe said. "Missing person, never found. It went cold in the 80s. She tapped the ledger. "But this changes everything. If these records are authentic and the names in here are who I think they are, this is going to blow up. Victor Hale's operation wasn't small time. He had people in the BLM, in local government, maybe higher, and his son Marcus has been running the same game for the last 20 years. Lena's chest tightened. "So what happens now?" "Now we build a case," Marlowe said. "We verify the documents, cross-reference the names, pull land records, interview witnesses, and we find out what happened to your father." "I already know what happened to him," Lena said quietly. "Victor Hale killed him." Marlowe's gaze softened. "We'll need proof of that too. But if it's there, we'll find it." She paused. "In the meantime, you're going to need protection. Marcus Hale isn't going to take this lying down. Once word gets out about what you found, he's going to come after you." "He already did," Lena said. "That's who those men worked for." "I know. And now they're in custody. But Marcus has resources. Money, connections, lawyers. He'll fight this every step of the way." Lena leaned back in her chair. "I don't care. I've already come this far." Marlowe studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll keep you here tonight, get your full statement in the morning. After that, we'll set you up somewhere safe until the investigation wraps up." "What about my horse?" "She's in the livestock trailer. One of our guys is with her. She'll be fine." Lena nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had been holding her together for the last 2 days was gone, and all that was left was bone-deep fatigue. Marlowe stood and gestured toward the tent flap. "There's a cot set up for you in the next tent over. Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning." Lena followed her out into the night. The camp was quieter now, most of the agents either gone or settling in for the night. Marlowe led her to a small tent with a canvas cot and a wool blanket. Lena sat down, and the cot creaked under her weight. "Thank you," she said. Marlowe paused at the entrance. "You did something remarkable tonight, Mrs. Carver. A lot of people would have given up, or never started in the first place." "I didn't have a choice," Lena said. "He was my father." Marlowe nodded and left. Lena lay down on the cot, still in her boots and jacket, and stared up at the canvas ceiling. Outside, she could hear the low murmur of voices, the hum of generators, the distant sound of helicopter blades as another crew came in. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't stop. She kept seeing her father's handwriting on that note, kept hearing Carter's voice as he talked about her father's death like it was a business decision, kept feeling the weight of the metal box in her hands. Somewhere out there, Marcus Hale was sitting in his ranch house, surrounded by everything his father had built on stolen land and blood, and by morning, he'd know that it was all about to come crashing down. Lena didn't sleep. She just lay there, waiting for the sun. When dawn came, Marlowe returned with a thermos of coffee and a notepad. Lena sat up, her back aching, and took the coffee gratefully. It was bitter and strong, and it burned going down. "Ready to talk?" Marlowe asked. Lena nodded. They spent the next 3 hours going over everything. Lena started at the beginning, the auction, the brand on Ash's shoulder, the decision to dig into her father's disappearance. She told Marlowe about the library, the news articles, the map her mother had left behind. She described finding the camp, the note in the tin box, the climb to the fence line, and then the men, the chase, the gunfire, the fire tower. Marlowe took notes the entire time, stopping occasionally to ask questions, to clarify details. When Lena finished, Marlowe set down her pen and leaned back. "That's one hell of a story," she said. "It's not a story," Lena said. "It happened." "I know, and we're going to make sure it sticks." Marlowe flipped through her notes. "The men we arrested last night are already talking, Carter especially. He's trying to cut a deal, pointing fingers at Marcus Hale. Says Marcus ordered him to retrieve the evidence, told him to do whatever it took. We've got enough to bring Marcus in for questioning today." Lena's pulse quickened. "You're arresting him?" "Not yet, but we will. We just need to make sure the case is airtight. Men like Marcus Hale don't go down easy." "What about my father?" Lena asked. "Can you find him?" Marlowe's expression shifted. "We're going to try. Based on what you've told me and what's in those documents, there's enough to reopen the investigation. We'll search the area around his last camp, bring in cadaver dogs, forensic teams. If he's out there, we'll find him." Lena's throat tightened. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Marlowe stood. "I'm heading back to the field office to coordinate with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney. You'll stay here for now. We've got agents on site, and they'll keep you safe. If you need anything, let them know." "I want to see my horse," Lena said. "I'll have someone take you over." Marlowe left, and a few minutes later, a young agent appeared at the tent. He was maybe 25, with a sunburned nose and an easy smile. "Mrs. Carver, I'm Agent Reese. I'll take you to the trailer." Lena followed him through the camp to where the livestock trailer was parked. When they opened the back, Ash was standing inside, her head low, munching on a flake of hay. She looked up when Lena climbed in, her cloudy eyes unseeing but her ears swiveling toward the sound. "Hey, girl," Lena said softly. She ran her hand down Ash's neck, checking for injuries. The mare had a few scrapes on her legs and her hooves were cracked worse than before, but she was alive. That was what mattered. Reese leaned against the trailer door. "She's a tough one. Most horses wouldn't have made it through what you put her through." "I didn't have a choice," Lena said. "Still, she's something special." Lena looked at the brand on Ash's shoulder, the circle with the line through it, her father's mark. "Yeah," she said quietly. "She is." She stayed with Ash for an hour, brushing her coat, picking out her hooves, talking to her in a low voice. When she finally climbed out of the trailer, Reese was still there. "Agent Marlowe called," he said. They're bringing in Marcus Hale for questioning this afternoon. Thought you'd want to know. Lena's stomach twisted. Where? Federal building in Great Falls. You won't be there for it, but Marlo said she'd keep you updated. Lena nodded. She wanted to be there, wanted to see Marcus Hale's face when they confronted him with the evidence. But she knew that wasn't how this worked. She'd done her part. Now it was up to the agents and the lawyers and the system to finish it. She just hoped the system didn't let her down. The rest of the day dragged. Lena stayed in the camp, pacing between the tents, drinking too much coffee, checking on Ash every hour. The agents gave her space, but she could feel them watching her, making sure she didn't wander off. By late afternoon, the sun was low and orange, and Lena was sitting outside her tent when Marlo's truck pulled into camp. The agent climbed out, and Lena could tell by her expression that something had happened. What is it? Lena asked, standing. Marlo walked over. We brought Marcus Hale in, questioned him for 3 hours. He lawyered up almost immediately, but before he did, he made a statement. What kind of statement? He admitted his father had illegal grazing operations on federal land. Said he didn't know the full extent of it until after Victor died, but he didn't report it because he was trying to protect the family legacy. Claimed he had no knowledge of what happened to your father. Lena's jaw tightened. He's lying. Probably. But without proof, we can't charge him with your father's death, not yet. What about the men he sent after me? Carter's already flipped. He's testifying that Marcus ordered him to retrieve the evidence and eliminate any witnesses. That's enough for conspiracy charges, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. Marcus isn't walking away from this. Lena felt some of the tension in her chest ease. So he's going to prison. If the case holds up, yes, but there's something else. Marlo paused. We started searching the area around your father's last camp this morning. The dogs picked up something about half a mile from the site. We're bringing in a forensic team tomorrow to excavate. Lena's breath caught. You found him? We don't know yet, but it's possible. Lena sat down heavily on the crate outside her tent. 40 years. 40 years of not knowing, of wondering, of her mother dying without answers. And now maybe they'd finally have the truth. I want to be there, Lena said. When you excavate, I want to see. Marlo hesitated. Mrs. Carver, I don't think that's a good idea. If it is your father, it's not going to be... I don't care, Lena interrupted. He's been out there alone for 40 years. I'm not letting him stay there a minute longer than he has to. Marlo studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll clear it. We're heading up at first light. That night, Lena didn't even try to sleep. She sat outside her tent, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, in the cold dark of the mountains, her father's body was waiting to be found, waiting to come home. She thought about the man he'd been, strong, stubborn, unwilling to back down when he knew something was wrong. He'd gone up into those mountains knowing it was dangerous, knowing Victor Hale wouldn't let him walk away with that evidence. But he'd gone anyway, because it was the right thing to do. And now, 40 years later, his daughter had finished what he started. Lena closed her eyes and let herself cry. Not from sadness, exactly. From relief. From exhaustion. From the weight of carrying this alone for so long and finally being able to set it down. When she opened her eyes again, the sky was starting to lighten. Marlo appeared a few minutes later, and together they loaded into the truck. Ash stayed behind in the trailer, and Lena promised her she'd be back. The drive up to the excavation site took 2 hours. When they arrived, the forensic team was already there, 4 people in white suits working carefully with brushes and trowels. Marlo led Lena to the edge of the site and stopped. They're almost done uncovering it, she said quietly. If you want to wait in the truck. I'm staying, Lena said. Marlo nodded and stepped back, giving her space. Lena watched as the team worked, their movements slow and precise. And then one of them stood and waved Marlo over. The 2 of them spoke in low voices, and Marlo turned back to Lena. It's him, she said. It's your father. Lena's legs almost gave out. Marlo caught her elbow, steadying her. Are you sure? Lena asked. The clothing matches what he was wearing when he disappeared. And there's a wallet. Driver's license with his name. Lena walked forward, her steps slow and unsteady. The forensic team moved aside, and she looked down into the shallow grave. Her father's bones lay curled on their side, partially covered in dirt and pine needles. The clothing had rotted away in places, but she could still see the remnants of the flannel shirt he'd always worn, the leather belt with the silver buckle. And there, resting near his ribs, was a small leather wallet. Lena knelt at the edge of the grave. Her hands were shaking. "We'll take care of him," Marlowe said gently. "Get him identified officially. Arrange for the remains to be released to you for burial." Lena nodded, unable to speak. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the dirt, and whispered, "I found you. I finally found you." One of the forensic team members crouched beside her. "Ma'am, there's something else you should see." He held up a small evidence bag. Inside was a spent bullet casing. "We found it near the skull," he said. "Looks like a rifle round. He was shot." Lena stared at the casing. Murder. Not an accident, not a disappearance. Murder. "Victor Hale killed him," she said, her voice flat. Marlowe knelt beside her. "We'll run ballistics, try to match it to a weapon. If we can tie it to Victor or anyone connected to him, we'll have proof." Lena stood, her jaw set. "You already have proof. It's all in that box. The permits, the bribes, the photos. My father found it, and Victor killed him for it. And then Marcus tried to do the same thing to me." Marlowe stood as well. "I know, and we're going to make sure everyone involved pays for it." They stayed at the site for another hour while the team finished their work. When they finally loaded her father's remains into the coroner's van, Lena watched it drive away, her chest tight. It was over. 40 years of not knowing, and now she knew. On the drive back to camp, Marlowe glanced at her. "What are you going to do now?" Lena looked out the window at the mountains. "Bury my father, testify at the trial, and then, I don't know, go home, I guess." "You've got a hell of a story to tell." Lena shook her head. "I don't want to tell it. I just want it to be done." Marlowe didn't push. They drove the rest of the way in silence. When they got back to camp, Lena went straight to the livestock trailer. Ash was standing in the same spot, her head low, dozing. Lena climbed in and wrapped her arms around the mare's neck. "We did it," she whispered. "We found him, and they're going to pay." Ash's ears swiveled toward her voice, and the mare let out a soft snort. Lena rested her forehead against Ash's shoulder, feeling the warmth of her, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. For the first time in weeks, Lena felt like she could breathe again. The days that followed felt unreal to Lena, like she was moving through someone else's life. Marlowe arranged for her to stay in a motel outside Great Falls while the investigation continued, a squat building with thin walls and a view of the highway. They brought Ash too, boarding her at a stable 10 minutes down the road. Lena visited her twice a day, brushing her coat, cleaning her hooves, talking to her about things that didn't matter just to fill the silence. The federal case against Marcus Hale moved faster than Lena expected. Within a week, the U.S. Attorney's Office had filed charges: conspiracy to obstruct justice, attempted murder, illegal use of federal lands, fraud. The evidence from the metal box was damning, and with Carter's testimony added to it, the case was airtight. Marcus hired a team of lawyers out of Denver, expensive men in tailored suits who showed up at the courthouse with briefcases and practiced smiles. But even they couldn't make the facts go away. Lena sat through the preliminary hearings, watching from the back of the courtroom as Marcus was arraigned. He looked smaller than she'd imagined, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a tired face. When the judge read the charges aloud, Marcus didn't flinch. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands folded on the table in front of him. Lena wanted to feel something when she looked at him: anger, satisfaction, maybe even pity. But all she felt was empty. This man's father had killed hers, and now he'd tried to do the same to her. And for what? Land, money, a legacy built on lies. The hearing lasted less than an hour. Marcus pled not guilty, and the judge set a trial date for 3 months out. As the guards led him away, Marcus turned and looked at Lena. Their eyes met for just a second, and she saw something flicker across his face. Maybe regret. Maybe just exhaustion. Then he was gone. Outside the courthouse, Marlowe was waiting. She walked with Lena to her truck, her expression unreadable. "How are you holding up?" Marlowe asked. "I'm fine," Lena said, though she wasn't sure that was true. "The forensic team finished their analysis on your father's remains," Marlowe said. "The bullet they found matches a rifle that was registered to Victor Hale in 1983. We pulled the records from the county sheriff's office. It's not conclusive on its own, but combined with everything else, it paints a pretty clear picture. Lena stopped walking. So you can prove Victor killed him? We can prove Victor owned the weapon that killed him, and we can prove your father was investigating Victor's illegal activities right before he disappeared. A jury will connect the dots. But Victor's dead, Lena said, so there's no trial, no justice. Marlowe's expression softened. There's still justice for you, and for your father. Marcus is going to prison. The Hale estate is being liquidated to pay restitution to the federal government. Everything Victor built is coming down. That's something. Lena nodded, though the knot in her chest didn't loosen. She'd wanted answers, and she'd gotten them. But answers didn't bring her father back. They didn't erase the 40 years her mother had spent waiting for a man who was never coming home. The coroner's releasing your father's remains tomorrow, Marlowe said. I can help you arrange transport if you need it. I want to bury him up there, Lena said, in the basin, where he spent his last night. Marlowe hesitated. That land is federal property. You'd need permits, approval from— I don't care about permits, Lena interrupted. He belongs up there, not in some cemetery in town where people can walk past his grave and not know who he was or what he did. Marlowe studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Let me make some calls. I'll see what I can do. 2 days later, Marlowe called Lena at the motel. She'd gotten approval from the Bureau of Land Management to scatter her father's ashes in the high basin, with the stipulation that a small memorial plaque would be placed there in his honor. It wasn't a burial, not in the traditional sense, but it was close enough. Lena made the arrangements herself. She had her father's remains cremated, the ashes placed in a simple wooden box. She borrowed a truck from the stable owner and loaded Ash into the trailer. Marlowe offered to come with her, but Lena declined. This was something she needed to do alone. The drive up into the mountains took most of the day. The roads were rough, barely maintained, and twice Lena had to stop to clear fallen branches from the path. By the time she reached the trailhead, the sun was already starting to dip toward the horizon. She unloaded Ash, saddled her, and tied the wooden box to the saddle horn with a length of rope. The ride up to the basin was slow. Ash moved carefully, her hooves picking through the rocky trail, and Lena let her set the pace. The air was cold and thin, and the wind carried the smell of pine and stone. It felt like the mountain was holding its breath. When they reached the basin, the light was golden, stretching long shadows across the scrub and the scattered patches of snow. Lena dismounted and led Ash to the spot where her father's camp had been. The fire ring was still there, the stones blackened and half buried in dirt. She knelt beside it and set the wooden box down. For a long time she just sat there, staring at the box, trying to find the words. But there weren't any. What could she say that would make 40 years of absence make sense? What could she say that would undo the pain, the loss, the questions that had haunted her mother until the day she died? Finally, Lena opened the box and stood. She walked to the edge of the basin, where the ground dropped away into a steep slope covered in wildflowers and low brush. She tipped the box, and her father's ashes spilled out, caught by the wind, scattering across the mountainside. You were right, Lena said quietly. About Hale. About all of it. And I'm sorry it took me so long to finish what you started. The wind picked up, swirling the ashes higher, carrying them out over the valley below. Lena watched until there was nothing left, until the last trace of her father had disappeared into the mountains he'd loved. She walked back to the fire ring and sat down, her legs folded beneath her. Ash stood nearby, grazing on the sparse grass, her tail swishing at flies. The sun touched the peaks to the west, turning them orange and red, and the shadows deepened in the basin. Lena pulled the metal box from her saddlebag, the one that had started all of this. She opened it and looked at the papers inside one last time, the permits, the photographs, the ledger. Proof of a crime that had cost her father his life. She thought about burning them, letting the evidence turn to ash like the man who'd uncovered it. But that felt wrong. These papers had a purpose. They were going to bring down Marcus Hale, dismantle the empire his father had built, and make sure the land her father had died protecting would be preserved for good. Lena closed the box and set it aside. She lay back on the cold ground, staring up at the sky as the first stars appeared. Somewhere far below, the world was still turning. People were going about their lives, unaware that up here, in this forgotten corner of the wilderness, a man had been laid to rest after 40 years of waiting. Lena stayed there until the sky was full dark and the cold started to seep into her bones. Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her jacket, and walked over to Ash. The mare lifted her head, her cloudy eyes staring at nothing, and Lena rested her forehead against the horse's neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Ash's ears flicked forward, and for a moment Lena could have sworn the mare understood. The ride back down the mountain took most of the night. Lena moved slowly, letting Ash navigate the trail in the darkness, trusting the mare's instincts more than her own eyes. By the time they reached the truck, the sky was starting to lighten in the east, the stars fading one by one. Lena loaded Ash into the trailer, climbed into the cab, and started the long drive back to town. The trial began 3 months later on a cold morning in November. The courthouse in Great Falls was packed, reporters lining the steps outside, cameras flashing as people filed in. Lena arrived early, slipping in through a side entrance to avoid the crowd. Marlo met her in the hallway and walked her to the witness room. "You ready for this?" Marlo asked. Lena nodded, though her stomach was in knots. She'd been over her testimony a dozen times with the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Ellis who didn't waste words. Ellis had told her to stick to the facts, to stay calm, to let the evidence speak for itself. But sitting in that small room, waiting to be called, Lena felt anything but calm. When they finally called her name, she walked into the courtroom and took the stand. The room was silent, every eye on her. Marcus Hale sat at the defense table, flanked by his lawyers, his expression blank. Lena looked at him for a moment, then turned her attention to Ellis. The prosecutor started with the basics. Lena's name, her relationship to Daniel Carver, the day she bought the horse at the auction. Then she moved into the details. The brand on Ash's shoulder, the map her mother had left behind, the climb into the mountains, the discovery of her father's camp, the metal box buried at the fence line. Ellis held up the box, now sealed in an evidence bag, and showed it to the jury. "Mrs. Carver, can you identify this?" "That's the box my father buried," Lena said. "The one with the evidence inside." "And what did you do after you found it?" "I tried to get it to the authorities, but Marcus Hale's men came after me. They chased me, shot at me, tried to kill me." One of Marcus's lawyers stood. "Objection, Your Honor, speculation. The witness has no direct evidence that Mr. Hale ordered." "Sustained," the judge said. "Mrs. Carver, please stick to what you personally witnessed." Lena took a breath. "Carter told me he worked for Marcus Hale. He said Marcus sent him to retrieve the evidence and eliminate witnesses. Those were his words." Ellis nodded. "And what happened next?" Lena described the fire tower, the radio call, the arrival of the federal agents. She talked about her father's remains being found, the bullet casing, the rifle registered to Victor Hale. By the time she finished, her voice was hoarse and her hands were shaking. Ellis thanked her and sat down. Then Marcus's lead attorney, a man named Grissom, stood for cross-examination. He was older, with silver hair and a voice like gravel. "Mrs. Carver," he began, "you've told us quite a story. But isn't it true that you had no direct contact with my client? That you never spoke to Marcus Hale, never received any communication from him?" "No," Lena said. "But his men, his alleged men," Grissom interrupted, "men who claim to have worked for him, but whose testimony is part of a plea deal to reduce their own sentences. Hardly reliable, wouldn't you say?" Lena's jaw tightened. "They tried to kill me. That's reliable enough. And yet you're here, alive and well, testifying against my client based on hearsay and circumstantial evidence." "I have the documents," Lena said. "The permits, the ledger, the photographs. That's not hearsay. That's proof." Grissom smiled thinly. "Proof of what Victor Hale did, perhaps, but not proof that Marcus had any knowledge of it, let alone that he ordered violence against you." Ellis stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Grissom is testifying. If he has a question—" "Sustained," the judge said. "Mr. Grissom, ask a question or sit down." Grissom turned back to Lena. "Mrs. Carver, isn't it possible that you've constructed a narrative here to assign blame where it doesn't belong? That you're so desperate to hold someone accountable for your father's death that you're willing to destroy an innocent man's life?" Lena leaned forward, her eyes locked on Grissom's. "The only innocent man here is my father. And he's dead because Victor Hale couldn't let the truth come out. Marcus knew what his father did. He's been covering it up for years. And when I got too close, he tried to finish what his father started. Grissom stared at her for a moment, then sat down without another word. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness after witness took the stand. Carter, who testified in detail about Marcus's orders, forensic experts who explained the evidence found at the burial site, BLM officials who confirmed the permits were forged. The defense argued that Marcus had been unaware of his father's crimes, that he'd only learned about them after Victor's death, and had been working to correct the situation quietly. But the evidence was overwhelming. On the final day, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Marcus's lawyers immediately filed for an appeal, and the judge banged his gavel for order. Lena sat in the back, watching it all unfold, and felt nothing but tired. Outside, Marlowe found her on the courthouse steps. "You did it," Marlowe said. "He's going away for a long time." Lena nodded. "How long?" "Sentencing is in 2 weeks, but with the charges he's facing, 20 years minimum, maybe more." 20 years, it still didn't seem like enough, but it was something. "What happens to the land?" Lena asked. "The Hale estate is being seized by the federal government. The land will be returned to public trust. There's talk of designating part of it as a wilderness preserve." Lena looked out at the mountains in the distance, the peaks white with early snow. "My father would have liked that." "There's something else," Marlowe said. She pulled an envelope from her jacket and handed it to Lena. "The BLM wants to name the preserve after him. The Daniel Carver Wilderness Area. They're putting up a plaque at the trailhead with his story." Lena opened the envelope. Inside was a mock-up of the plaque, a simple bronze plate with her father's name, and a brief description of what he'd done. She stared at it for a long time, her throat tight. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marlowe put a hand on her shoulder. "You did this. Not me. You brought the truth to light. You finished what he started." Lena folded the envelope and slipped it into her pocket. "I need to go check on my horse." Marlowe smiled. "Go, you've earned it." Lena drove to the stable in the fading light of the afternoon. Ash was in her usual stall, standing with her head low, dozing. When Lena opened the gate, the mare lifted her head and took a step forward. "Hey, girl," Lena said, running her hand down Ash's neck. The mare's coat was thick now, her weight finally back to where it should be. Her hooves had been trimmed and shod, and the scrapes on her legs had healed. She looked good, better than good. Lena led her out into the paddock and let her graze. The sun was setting, turning the sky pink and orange, and the air was sharp with the promise of winter. Lena sat on the fence and watched Ash move through the grass, her blind eyes not slowing her down at all. The stable owner, a man named Dutch, wandered over and leaned on the fence beside her. "Heard the verdict came in today?" he said. "Yeah," Lena said. "Good. That family had it coming." Lena didn't answer. She just watched Ash, the way the light caught her coat, the way she moved with quiet confidence through a world she couldn't see. "What are you going to do now?" Dutch asked. Lena thought about it. The cabin was still hers, sitting empty on the edge of town. She could go back there, settle into the quiet life she'd been living before all this started. Or she could sell it, move somewhere new, start over. But the truth was, she didn't want to start over. She wanted to go home. "I think I'm going to take her back," Lena said, nodding at Ash. "Back to the cabin. She deserves some peace." Dutch nodded. "She's earned it. So have you." Lena stayed at the stable until the stars came out. Then she walked Ash back to her stall, filled her water bucket, and made sure she had enough hay for the night. Before she left, she pressed her forehead against the brand on Ash's shoulder one more time. "We did it," she whispered. "We finished it." Ash's ears flicked, and she let out a soft snort. Lena smiled and walked out into the night. A week later, Lena loaded Ash into the borrowed trailer one last time and drove back to the cabin. The place looked smaller than she remembered, the paint peeling, the roof sagging in one corner. But it was hers. And it was home. She set Ash up in the old lean-to, reinforcing the walls and replacing the roof with fresh timber. She built a small paddock out back where the mare could wander, and she spent her days fixing up the cabin, patching holes, replacing broken windows, making it livable again. The sentencing hearing came and went. Marcus Hale was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Lena didn't attend. She'd already said everything she needed to say. Winter came early that year, snow falling thick and heavy, blanketing the mountains in white. Lena spent most of her time indoors, reading by the fire, drinking coffee, watching the world outside her window. Ash stayed close to the cabin, her coat thick against the cold, and Lena checked on her every morning and every night. One evening in late December, Lena walked out to the lean-to and found Ash standing in the paddock, her head raised, her ears pricked forward. Lena followed the mare's gaze and saw a deer standing at the edge of the trees, watching them. For a moment, the three of them stood perfectly still, the woman, the blind horse, and the deer. And then the deer turned and disappeared into the forest, and the moment was gone. Lena walked over to Ash and rested her hand on the mare's neck. The brand was still there, faded but visible, a mark of a man who'd tried to do the right thing and paid for it with his life. But it was also a mark of survival, of endurance, of two creatures who'd been broken and discarded and had somehow found their way back. "We're okay," Lena said quietly. "We're finally okay." Ash turned her head toward Lena's voice, and for just a second, Lena could have sworn the mare understood. The snow fell softly around them, and the mountains stood silent and still. Somewhere far below, the world kept turning. But up here, in this quiet corner of the wilderness, Lena Carver stood beside a $1 horse and felt, for the first time in 40 years, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Part 5. Lưu ý. Viết 8.000 đến 8.500 từ liên kết, liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, phá hỏi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả quá mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dần bắt buộc. Không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Showmore 11:24, Part 5. The weeks that followed the excavation moved with a strange, dreamlike quality that Lena couldn't quite shake. She stayed in the motel outside Great Falls, watching through the thin curtains as November turned the landscape gray and brittle. Marlowe checked in every few days with updates, forensic reports, ballistics matches, witness statements, but the words all started to blur together. What mattered was already settled in Lena's mind. Her father had been murdered. Victor Hale had pulled the trigger, and now his son was going to pay for trying to bury the truth a second time. The coroner released her father's remains on a Wednesday afternoon. Lena drove to the medical examiner's office alone and signed the paperwork with hands that wouldn't quite hold steady. They gave her a plain cardboard box, surprisingly light, and she carried it out to the truck like she was carrying something fragile that might break if she moved too fast. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, the box on the passenger seat beside her, trying to figure out what she was supposed to feel. Relief? Grief? Some combination of both? But all she felt was tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than her bones, deeper than sleep could fix. Finally, she started the engine and drove to the funeral home. The director was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Lena told him she wanted her father cremated, the ashes placed in a wooden box, something simple. He nodded and made notes on a clipboard, and 2 days later he called to say it was ready. Lena picked up the box on Friday morning. It was made of plain pine, unvarnished, with a small brass plate on the lid engraved with her father's name and the years of his life. She ran her fingers over the letters, tracing the curve of the D in Daniel, and thought about how strange it was that a whole life could be reduced to a name and 2 dates. She put the box in the truck and drove to the stable where Ash was boarded. The mare was standing in her stall, her head low, dozing in the pale sunlight that slanted through the window. When Lena opened the gate, Ash lifted her head and took a step forward, her nostrils flaring. "We're going back up," Lena said quietly. "One more time." She saddled Ash slowly, checking the cinch twice, making sure the saddlebags were secure. Then she tied the wooden box to the saddle horn with a length of soft rope, positioning it carefully so it wouldn't shift. Ash stood perfectly still through all of it, her ears swiveling to track Lena's movements. The drive up to the trailhead took most of the day. The roads were worse than before, rutted and icy in places, and twice Lena had to stop and clear fallen branches. By the time she reached the parking area at the base of the trail, the sun was already dropping toward the western peaks, turning the sky the color of old bruises. She unloaded Ash, mounted up, and started the climb. The trail felt different this time, quieter. The aspens had lost their leaves, and the bare branches clattered in the wind like bones. Snow had already fallen in the higher elevations, dusting the rocks and turning the narrow creek into a ribbon of black water cutting through white. Ash moved carefully, her hooves crunching on the frozen ground, and Lena let her set the pace. They climbed for hours, the world growing colder and darker around them. Lena's breath came out in clouds, and her fingers ached inside her gloves. But she didn't stop. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead, on the ridgeline rising against the sky, and she thought about her father making this same climb 40 years ago, not knowing he wouldn't make it back down. By the time they reached the basin, the last light was draining from the sky. Lena dismounted and led Ash to the spot where her father's camp had been. The fire ring was still there, the stones dark against the snow. She stood beside it for a long moment, the wooden box in her hands, and tried to find words that made sense. But there weren't any words big enough to hold 40 years of absence. No way to explain to the wind and the mountains and the empty sky what it had cost. Not just her father's life, but her mother's slow death afterward, the way she'd withered into silence and grief until there was nothing left. No way to undo the damage Victor Hale had done when he decided one man's life was worth less than his empire. Lena opened the box and walked to the edge of the basin, where the ground dropped away into the valley below. She tipped the box, and her father's ashes spilled out into the wind, scattering across the slope in a gray cloud that caught the last of the daylight before disappearing into the darkness. "You were right," Lena said, her voice rough, "about all of it, and I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner." The wind was the only answer, cold and sharp, carrying the ashes away until there was nothing left but the empty box in her hands. She walked back to the fire ring and sat down on one of the stones. Ash stood nearby, her head low, her breath steaming in the cold air. The stars were starting to come out overhead, sharp and bright, and Lena pulled her jacket tighter and let herself sit with the weight of everything that had happened. Her father had come up here knowing the risk. He'd found evidence that could destroy Victor Hale, and he'd known Hale wouldn't let him walk away with it. But he'd come anyway, because he'd believed that some things were worth dying for. Truth, justice. The idea that powerful men shouldn't be allowed to steal what didn't belong to them just because they could. And now, 40 years later, his daughter had finished what he started. Not because she was brave or righteous or anything special, but because a blind horse with her father's brand had shown up at an auction, and Lena had been stubborn enough, or foolish enough, to follow where that thread led. She thought about the people she'd met along the way. Marlowe, who could have dismissed her as a grieving daughter chasing shadows, but chose to listen instead. Carter, who'd made the wrong choices but found the courage to make one right choice when it mattered. Even Ash, who'd survived neglect and blindness in a mountain chase that should have killed her, and who stood now in the freezing darkness like she'd been doing this her whole life. None of them were perfect. None of them had done everything right. But together, they'd been enough. Lena stood and walked over to Ash. She rested her forehead against the mare's neck, feeling the warmth of her, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. "Thank you," she whispered, "for carrying me this far." Ash's ears flicked, and she let out a soft snort that sounded almost like agreement. Lena stayed in the basin until the cold became unbearable, until her fingers were numb and her teeth were chattering. Then she mounted Ash and started the long ride back down the mountain. They reached the truck just before midnight. Lena loaded Ash into the trailer, climbed into the cab, and drove back toward town with the heater blasting and her mind still full of ghosts. The trial began the first week of December. Lena had been dreading it, the idea of sitting in a courtroom and reliving everything in front of strangers. But when the day came, she felt strangely calm. She dressed in the only decent clothes she owned, a plain black sweater and slacks her mother had bought her years ago, and drove to the courthouse in Great Falls. The building was old and imposing, all stone and high ceilings, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back row, their cameras ready, and spectators filled every available seat. Lena slipped in through a side door and found a spot near the front, close enough to see Marcus Hale when they brought him in. He looked older than she'd expected, smaller. His hair was gray at the temples, and there were deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Lena's truck, but it didn't make him look powerful. It just made him look tired. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The charges were read aloud: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, attempted murder, fraud, and Marcus pled not guilty to all of them. His lawyers were expensive men from Denver with smooth voices and practiced expressions, and they spent the first day of the trial trying to paint Marcus as a victim of his father's crimes, a man who'd inherited a mess he was trying to clean up. But the evidence didn't support that story. The prosecution called witness after witness. Carter took the stand first, his voice steady as he described the orders Marcus had given him: find the evidence, retrieve it, eliminate anyone who got in the way. He talked about the chase through the mountains, the gunfire at the fire tower, the moment the federal agents arrived and everything fell apart. The defense tried to discredit him, pointing out his plea deal, suggesting he was lying to save himself. But Carter didn't flint. He just kept telling the truth. Then came the forensic experts, walking the jury through the evidence found in the metal box, the forged permits, the bribery ledger, the photographs of cattle grazing on federal land. They explained how the documents tied directly to Victor Hale's operation and how Marcus had continued that operation for 2 decades after his father's death, using the same methods, the same corrupt officials, the same lies. On the third day, they called Lena to the stand. She walked to the front of the courtroom, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Then she sat down and looked out at the faces staring back at her, the jury, the reporters, Marcus and his lawyers, and she took a breath. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Ellis, started with the basics. Mrs. Carver, can you tell the court how this case began for you? Lena nodded. I bought a horse at an auction, a blind mare half dead that nobody wanted. I paid $1 for her. And why did you buy her? Because she had my father's brand on her shoulder, a brand I hadn't seen in 40 years, not since my father disappeared. Ellis walked her through the rest of it, the research at the library, the map her mother had left behind, the climb into the mountains, the discovery of the evidence. Lena spoke slowly, carefully, choosing her words the way she'd been taught. But when she got to the part about the chase, about Carter and his men shooting at her, about the fire at the tower, her voice wavered. Take your time, Ellis said gently. Lena swallowed hard. They tried to kill me, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I'd found proof of what Victor Hale did, and Marcus sent them to make sure that proof never saw daylight. How do you know Marcus sent them? Carter told me. He said he worked for Marcus, that Marcus had ordered him to retrieve the evidence and eliminate witnesses. Ellis nodded and stepped back. No further questions. The defense attorney, a man named Grissom, stood for cross-examination. He was older with silver hair and a voice like gravel, and he smiled at Lena like they were old friends. Mrs. Carver, he began, you've had quite an ordeal. I can only imagine how difficult this has been for you. Lena didn't answer. She just waited. Grissom walked closer. But isn't it true that you never actually spoke to Marcus Hale? That you have no direct evidence he gave the orders you claim he gave? Carter told me, Carter, who is facing life in prison without a plea deal. Carter, who has every reason to lie if it means reducing his sentence. He wasn't lying, Lena said. How can you be sure? Because he tried to kill me, Lena said, her voice sharp. You don't risk that kind of exposure, that kind of violence, unless someone powerful is telling you to. And the only person with that kind of power, the only person who had anything to lose if that evidence came out, was Marcus Hale. Grissom's smile faded. Or perhaps you've constructed a narrative to make sense of a tragedy. Your father disappeared 40 years ago under mysterious circumstances, and you've spent your whole life wanting answers. So when you found that evidence, you decided Marcus must be responsible, because it was easier than accepting that some questions don't have answers. Lena leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. My father's body was found with a bullet in his skull. That bullet came from a rifle registered to Victor Hale. The evidence I found proves Victor was running an illegal operation, and my father was going to expose him. Those aren't mysteries. Those are facts. And Marcus knew about all of it. He's been covering it up for 20 years, and when I got too close, he tried to finish what his father started. Grissom stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned away. No further questions. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness after witness took the stand, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. By the time the prosecution rested, the case against Marcus was overwhelming. The defense tried to argue that he'd been ignorant of his father's crimes, that he'd only learned about them after Victor's death, and had been working quietly to make amends. But the jury didn't buy it. On the final day, after 4 hours of deliberation, they came back with a verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Marcus sat perfectly still, his face blank, while his lawyers immediately began talking about appeals. The judge banged her gavel and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later. And then it was over. Lena walked out of the courthouse into the cold December air and stood on the steps, watching people stream past her. Marlowe found her a few minutes later, her expression unreadable. You did it, Marlowe said. Lena shook her head. We did it. No, Marlowe said. This was you. You're the one who wouldn't let it go. You're the one who climbed that mountain and found the truth. Don't let anyone tell you different. Lena looked out at the street, at the reporters packing up their cameras, at the strangers going about their lives like nothing had happened. What comes next? Sentencing in 2 weeks. With the charges he's facing, Marcus is looking at 25 years minimum, maybe more. And the land? The Hale estate is being seized by the federal government. All of it, the ranch, the grazing permits, everything. It'll be returned to public trust. Marlowe paused. There's something else. The Bureau of Land Management wants to designate part of the land as a wilderness preserve, and they want to name it after your father. Lena's throat tightened. What? Marlowe pulled an envelope from her jacket and handed it over. Inside was a mock-up of a bronze plaque, simple and dignified, with her father's name and a brief inscription. In memory of Daniel Carver, who gave his life to protect these lands from corruption and greed. May this wilderness stand as a testament to his courage. Lena stared at it, her vision blurring. He would have liked that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They're putting it up at the trailhead next spring. There'll be a dedication ceremony. They want you to be there. Lena folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I'll be there. Marlowe put a hand on her shoulder. What are you going to do now? Lena thought about it. The cabin was still hers, sitting empty outside of town. Ash was still at the stable, waiting. And for the first time in weeks, Lena felt like she could breathe. I'm going home, she said. The sentencing hearing came and went. Lena didn't attend. She'd already said everything she needed to say. And she didn't need to watch Marcus Hale's face when the judge handed down 27 years in federal prison. Marlowe called her afterward with the news, and Lena thanked her and hung up. She spent the rest of December fixing up the cabin. She patched the roof, replaced the broken windows, repainted the walls. She rebuilt the lean-to for Ash, reinforcing the walls and adding a proper gate. The work was hard and her hands blistered, but it felt good. It felt like building something instead of tearing something down. On Christmas Eve, she brought Ash home. The mare stepped out of the trailer cautiously, her hooves crunching on the snow, and Lena led her to the lean-to. Ash sniffed the air, her ears swiveling, and then walked inside like she'd been living there her whole life. Lena stood in the doorway and watched her for a while. The mare was filling out now, her ribs no longer visible, her coat thick and glossy. The scars on her legs had faded, and her hooves were strong. She looked nothing like the dying horse Lena had bought for $1 4 months ago. You made it, Lena said quietly. We both did. That night, Lena sat by the fire with a cup of coffee and her mother's journal open on her lap. She read through the entries one more time, the clippings about her father's disappearance, the notes her mother had made, the map that had started everything. And then she closed the journal and set it aside. She'd spent 40 years carrying the weight of not knowing, and now she knew. Her father had been murdered. Victor Hale had pulled the trigger. And Marcus Hale had tried to keep that secret buried, no matter the cost. But the truth was out now, carved into bronze and preserved in federal law. Her father's name would be remembered. His sacrifice would mean something. It wasn't closure, exactly. Closure implied an ending, and some things didn't end. The grief would always be there, buried under the surface, waiting for quiet moments when her guard was down. But it was different now, lighter. She could carry it without it crushing her. Winter deepened. Snow fell in heavy, silent curtains, burying the world in white. Lena spent her days chopping wood, feeding Ash, reading by the fire. She didn't go into town unless she had to, and when she did, people stared. Some of them whispered. A few shook her hand and told her she'd done a brave thing. Lena thanked them and left as quickly as she could. She wasn't interested in being brave. She was just interested in being left alone. In late January, Marlowe called. "The wilderness dedication is set for May," she said. "They want you to speak." "I'm not a public speaker," Lena said. "You don't have to give a speech. Just say a few words. People want to hear from you." Lena hesitated. "I'll think about it." "Good. And Lena, how are you doing?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Lena looked out the window at the snow, at Ash standing in the paddock with her head low, at the mountains rising in the distance. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Some days are better than others." "That's normal," Marlowe said. "What you went through, what you did, that doesn't just go away." "I know. If you need to talk, I'm here." "I know," Lena said again, and she meant it. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in patches, the creeks swelling with runoff. Lena started riding Ash again, short trips at first, just around the property. The mare moved carefully, her hooves picking through the mud, but she seemed to enjoy it. Her ears were always forward, her head high, and Lena could have sworn she was smiling. In April, Lena got a letter from the BLM with details about the dedication ceremony. It would be held at the trailhead in the basin, with federal officials, local ranchers, and members of the press in attendance. They wanted her to unveil the plaque and say a few words about her father. Lena read the letter 3 times, then set it aside. She didn't want to do it, didn't want to stand in front of strangers and talk about the most painful thing that had ever happened to her. But she knew her father would have wanted his story told, would have wanted people to know what he'd tried to do and what it had cost him. So she wrote a speech. Just a few paragraphs, short and simple. She practiced it in front of the mirror, her voice shaking, and then she folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. The day of the ceremony was bright and clear, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. Lena drove up to the trailhead with Ash in the trailer, arriving early to avoid the crowd. But by the time she parked, there were already dozens of people gathered, federal agents in uniform, ranchers in dusty hats, reporters with cameras. Marlowe was there, along with several officials from the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service. When Lena climbed out of the truck, Marlowe walked over and shook her hand. "You ready?" "No," Lena said, "but I'm here." They walked to the trailhead together, where a small stage had been set up. The plaque was covered with a cloth, waiting to be unveiled. Lena stood to the side while the officials gave their speeches, talking about conservation and legacy and the importance of protecting public lands. She barely heard any of it. She just stared at the covered plaque, her heart pounding. Finally, they called her name. Lena walked to the podium, pulled the folded paper from her pocket, and looked out at the crowd. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her hands shaking too badly. But then she saw Marlowe in the front row, nodding at her, and she took a breath. "My father was a simple man," Lena began, her voice rough. "He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He just believed that some things were worth standing up for, even when it cost him everything." She paused, her eyes burning. 40 years ago, he came up into these mountains because he found evidence that powerful men were stealing land that belonged to all of us. And when he tried to do the right thing, they killed him for it. For 40 years, I didn't know what happened to him. And for 40 years, the men responsible got away with it. She looked down at the paper, then back up at the crowd. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. And my father's sacrifice wasn't for nothing. This land is protected now. His name is remembered. and the people who tried to silence him are in prison. Her voice cracked. That's not justice, exactly. Justice would have been my father coming home alive. But it's something, and I hope it's enough. She stepped back and the crowd applauded. Lena barely heard it. She walked over to the plaque, grabbed the cloth, and pulled it away. The bronze gleamed in the sunlight, her father's name carved deep into the metal. Below it, the inscription, "In memory of Daniel Carver, who gave his life to protect these lands." Lena reached out and traced the letters with her fingers, the same way she'd traced the brand on Ash's shoulder all those months ago. And for the first time since this whole thing started, she felt something like peace. After the ceremony, people came up to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her how brave she was. Lena nodded and smiled and said the right things, but all she wanted was to leave. Finally, Marlo rescued her, pulling her aside. "You did good," Marlo said. "I just want to go home." "I know, but there's someone here who wants to meet you first." Marlo led her to an older woman standing near the edge of the crowd. She was maybe 70, with white hair and kind eyes, and she held a photograph in her hands. "Mrs. Carver," the woman said, "my name is Ellen. My husband worked for the BLM in the 80s. He was one of the inspectors Victor Hale bribed." Lena stiffened. "He died 5 years ago," Ellen continued, her voice shaking. "But before he did, he told me what he'd done, how Hale had paid him to look the other way, and how he'd spent the rest of his life regretting it. He wanted to come forward, to tell the truth, but he was too scared." She held out the photograph. "This is him. I wanted you to see his face, to know that he was sorry." Lena took the photograph. It showed a young man in a ranger's uniform, smiling at the camera. He looked honest, decent, like someone who'd made a mistake he couldn't take back. "Thank you," Lena said quietly, handing the photo back, "for telling me." Ellen nodded, tears streaming down her face, and walked away. Lena stood there for a long moment, staring after her. Then she turned and walked back to the truck. She loaded Ash into the trailer, climbed into the cab, and drove home. That night, she sat on the porch with Ash standing in the paddock beside her. The sun was setting, turning the sky pink and orange, and the air was cool and clear. Lena rested her hand on the mare's neck and looked out at the mountains. "We did it," she said softly. "We finished what he started." Ash's ears flicked, and she let out a soft snort. Lena smiled. "Yeah, I know. It's over." And for the first time in 40 years it was. The world kept turning after that. Summer came, hot and dry, and Lena spent her days working the land around the cabin, fixing fences, clearing brush. She rode Ash in the early mornings, before the heat set in, and they moved through the hills together like they'd been doing it their whole lives. People stopped talking about the trial. Marcus Hale became just another name in a federal prison, and the Hale estate was broken up and sold off in pieces. The Daniel Carver Wilderness Area was officially designated in July, and hikers started using the trails, stopping to read the plaque at the trailhead before heading up into the mountains. Lena didn't go back up there. She didn't need to. Her father was at peace, and so was she. One evening in late August, she was sitting on the porch when a truck pulled up the dirt road. Marlo climbed out carrying a folder. "Thought you'd want to see this," Marlo said, handing it over. Lena opened the folder. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Great Falls Tribune. The headline read, "Hale corruption case leads to federal land reform." Lena skimmed the article. It talked about new regulations being put in place to prevent the kind of fraud Victor Hale had committed, about increased oversight of grazing permits, about transparency and accountability. At the bottom there was a quote from a senator. "Daniel Carver's death was a tragedy, but his legacy will ensure that public lands are protected for generations to come." Lena closed the folder and set it aside. He would have been happy about that. "I think so too," Marlo said. She sat down on the porch steps. "How are you doing?" "Better," Lena said. And it was true. The nightmares had stopped. The weight in her chest had lifted. She still thought about her father every day, but it didn't hurt the way it used to. "Good," Marlo said. "You've earned it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun drop behind the mountains. Then Marlo stood. "I should get going, but if you ever need anything, I know where to find you," Lena said. Marlo smiled and drove away, leaving Lena alone with the fading light and the quiet. That night, Lena walked out to the paddock where Ash was grazing. The mare lifted her head when Lena approached, her cloudy eyes reflecting the last of the daylight. "You know what I learned?" Lena said, running her hand down Ash's neck. "That sometimes the things we think are broken are just waiting for someone to see them differently. You were supposed to be worthless, used up, not worth saving, but you carried me up that mountain and back down again. You saved my life as much as I saved yours." Ash nudged her gently, and Lena smiled. "And my father," she continued, her voice softer now. "He was supposed to be forgotten. Just another missing person, another cold case that nobody cared about. But he wasn't. He mattered. What he did mattered. And now people will remember." She pressed her forehead against Ash's neck and closed her eyes. "I spent so long thinking I was alone, that nobody cared. But I was wrong. There are still good people out there. People like Marlowe, who listen when they don't have to. People like Carter, who found the courage to do the right thing even when it was hard. And people like you, who just kept going when every reason said to quit." She stepped back and looked at the mare, at the faded brand on her shoulder. "We're not perfect, neither of us. But we're here. And that's enough." The stars came out one by one, filling the sky with light. Lena stood in the paddock with Ash beside her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt whole.